Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into one of the foundational stories of Western civilization, the birth of philosophy. Now, the story we're usually told is about this sudden, brilliant flash of rational thought happening right on the shores of the Aegean Sea. But what if that story is missing its first and maybe its most crucial chapter? Let's just start with this incredible line from Plato's writings. You have an Egyptian priest talking to Solon, one of the most respected figures in all of Athens, and he's basically dismissing the entire Greek sense of history as childish. He says that while catastrophes have wiped Greece's memory clean, Egypt's temples hold records stretching back for millennia, stories that even the Greeks themselves had completely forgotten. You know, that one quote raises a question that cuts right to the heart of Western identity. Was the Greek miracle really this spontaneous explosion of genius, a totally unique European event that created rational thought from thin air? Or was it something else entirely? A transmission, a translation, maybe even an initiation into a body of knowledge that was already ancient when the first Greek sages set sail? Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll deconstruct that traditional myth of the Greek miracle. Then, we're going to listen to the ancient witnesses, the Greeks themselves, and see what they had to say. After that, we'll jump to a totally different perspective and see how Islamic tradition saw these same thinkers. Then, we'll get into the fierce modern debates over this legacy. And finally, we'll try to land on a new synthesis that goes beyond a simple either-or. All right, first up, let's go head-to-head with that traditional story, the one that's dominated Western education for centuries. For the longest time, the main story was Le Miracle Grec, or the Greek miracle. It's this very Eurocentric idea that philosophy was a purely homegrown product of the Greek city-state, the polis. It suggests a clean, sudden break from the mythical worlds of their Eastern neighbors. But there's another story, an older one, that the ancients themselves believed in. And in this version, the path to wisdom wasn't a local invention. It was a long, hard journey. It was a kind of sacred pilgrimage, what the Greeks called a theoria, to the great centers of knowledge in Egypt and Babylon, to be initiated into their secrets. And here's the kicker. This counter-narrative, it's not a modern idea. It comes directly from the ancient world itself, from Greek and Roman writers like Herodotus, Plato, and the Neoplatonists who came later. They are the original source for this story. I mean, just look at the very first figures. Thales, the so-called father of philosophy, was said to have brought the science of geometry from Egypt to Greece. And his most famous idea, that everything comes from water, sounds a whole lot like the Egyptian creation myth of the primordial ocean, Nun. Then you have the lawmaker Solon, who is said to have traveled to Egypt and literally borrowed laws from the pharaoh, like one that required every citizen to declare where their money came from each year. But the most mind-blowing story has to be Pythagoras's. His ancient biographers describe this epic 34-year educational journey. He supposedly spends 22 years in Egypt, where he has to go through these intense trials, even reportedly circumcision, just to get access to the inner temples. Then he's captured by invading Persians and taken to Babylon, where he spends another 12 years learning from the Magi. Only after all that, as a man in his late 50s, does he finally return to the Greek world and found his school, which, by the way, was structured not like an open Greek forum, but like the secret, hierarchical Eastern temples he'd spent his life in. And this wasn't just about the early, almost mythical guys. Get this, even Plato, the bedrock of all Western philosophy, is part of this tradition. The geographer Strabo, visiting Egypt centuries later, said he was shown the actual house where Plato had supposedly lived for 13 years while studying with the priests. To the people of the ancient world, this wasn't a controversial theory, it was just a fact. Okay, let's switch gears completely. For centuries, while Europe was in its so-called Dark Ages, Islamic scholars were busy preserving and studying these Greek texts, but they read them in a completely different and pretty fascinating light. See, to Islamic thinkers, these guys weren't pagan philosophers who based their authority on rational argument or logos. No, they were hakim, wise men or sages, whose authority came from hikmah, which is like a divinely inspired wisdom. They saw them as monotheists who had caught a glimpse of the same universal truth that was later fully revealed to the prophets. So the key concept here is something called the Mishkat al-Nubuwah, or the niche of prophecy. The idea from the great 12th century scholar al-Shahristani is that there is one single source of divine light, one niche where all truth comes from. The Hebrew prophets got this light directly as revelation, but he argued the Greek sages got their wisdom from that exact same source, making them all part of the same sacred history.
And this allowed for this incredible synthesis. Al-Shahristani, for instance, claimed Pythagoras got his wisdom from the followers of King Solomon. A group called the Brethren of Purity saw Pythagorean math not as some secular tool, but as a spiritual path to understanding God's unity. And the philosopher Suharwardi built his whole system on unifying the wisdom of Plato and Pythagoras with Zoroaster, seeing them all as mystics staring at the same divine light.
Now, this ancient way of looking at things was pretty much forgotten in the West. So when the debate finally came roaring back in the modern era, it exploded. It became a huge battleground for cultural identity, for race, and for the very definition of Western civilization itself. The narrative just swung wildly from one extreme to the other. It started with romantic fiction, which influenced groups like the Freemasons. Then in the 19th century, that was completely rejected for an Aryan model that tried to make Greece a purely European, racially distinct starting point. Then, in the 20th century, the critiques came hard and fast. George G.M. James's book Stolen Legacy made the explosive claim that it was all just theft. And then Martin Bernal's massive work, Black Athena, argued that this whole Aryan model was a modern racist invention, and that we should just go back to what the ancient Greeks themselves believed, a story of deep cultural mixing with Egypt and the Levant. And beyond all the arguments, we've got hard archaeological evidence that complicates the whole story of Greek invention. Just look at this. It's a Babylonian clay tablet called Plimpton 322. It dates to about 1800 BCE. That is over 1,000 years before Pythagoras was even born. And it has a table of Pythagorean triples, proving the math behind his famous theorem existed in Mesopotamia long, long before him. So, where does all this leave us? Was it a spontaneous Greek miracle? Or was it a stolen legacy? Well, the answer, as it so often is, isn't one or the other. The evidence doesn't really point to a simple theft, but it sure doesn't point to creation out of nothing either. It points to a unique and powerful synthesis. We've seen how all these different cultures have spun this connection to fit their own story. For the ancient Greeks, it gave their wisdom an ancient, sacred authority. For Islamic scholars, it let them fold Greek thought into a universal divine history. And for modern thinkers, it's become this battleground for defining civilization itself, whether it's about public reason or charges of theft versus cultural exchange. So maybe here's the key takeaway. The true Greek miracle wasn't inventing the raw material, the geometry, the astronomy, the ideas about the soul. The real genius was in the radical transformation of that material. It was about taking the sacred, secret knowledge of the Egyptian temple and the practical math of the Babylonian scribe and throwing it into the unique arena of the Greek polis, a world of open, public, rational debate. Maybe the best way to think about it is this. The seed of wisdom was cultivated for thousands of years in the East. But when that seed was planted in the rocky, argumentative soil of the Aegean, the flower that bloomed was something the world had never seen before. And that leaves us with one final big question. This whole story of travel and transmission and transformation really messes with our neat little categories. When you look at the deep, tangled roots of philosophy, is it really possible or even useful to divide our shared human heritage into clean boxes labeled Western or Eastern? Thank you for joining this explainer.